All right. Would you please open up your Bible to Genesis chapter 21? I am excited to do this lesson tonight in Genesis 21 because whenever I came back to Genesis and I said this is going to be our text, I read through it, and this happens quite a bit, but I had in my head, okay, this is the direction that the lesson is going to go, and this is some of our main takeaways that we're going to get from it. And if you look at the text, you'll see it says the birth of Isaac. But the next section down especially is the section where Sarah kicks Ishmael and Hagar out and tells them to leave. I was reading through this text and I thought, okay, we're just going to blast Sarah. We'll talk about bad behavior and jealousy because we saw something similar to that back in Genesis 16. And I did some reading about this. I've been following along with 3 different books just to try and get some ideas and some direction for the text. And I learned some things about Genesis 21, 1 through 12, that really pointed my mind in another direction. And I think that tonight what we'll end up doing is we'll see it's going to take a lot of work. We're going to have to mine and work hard for one little payout at the end. I say one little payout at the end, but it's a once you see the lesson for tonight, hopefully you see what I'm seeing in this, and then you get to that last sentence and the application that's going to come from this, I hope that you feel like I do, like that was worth it. I learned something, and that's going to help me to move forward in my thinking and my faith. And so I'm excited to do that. I keep forgetting to do this. I'm not sure about this. I think I'm 3 weeks late on this. Are we on the 3rd Sunday of October? You know, I should have done this on the 1st Sunday of October. The 1st Sunday of October was our 1-year anniversary for having elders. And I keep thinking about it over and over again, and I keep forgetting to say anything about it. And here we are Sunday night on the 3rd Sunday when it finally comes to my head. But I wish I had remembered to do it on a Sunday morning, but this would be a really good time to express your appreciation to Ed and Mark for the work that they've done. I have a lot of appreciation. I've told you this already. Just side note, I don't have time to talk about this. I need to get it in the text. But this last year of working with shepherds and the deacons who have been doing their deacon responsibilities, this last year has been the best year of my, I hate to call it this, career, preaching career. My time in full-time preaching, working in the situation that we have, has been the best for me so far. And things are good with our congregation. Don't forget to say your appreciation. Those things are important. Okay, number 1. Let's start in verse 7. We'll read it first. And I'll tell you, it's on the board behind me right now. I'll tell you, verses 1 through 7, the main thing that we're going to see in this text is this lesson over and over again. God always fulfills his promises. Look at all of the different ways that you see this. Verse 1. The Lord visited Sarah. As he had said, we're just going to build. It's not that God visited Sarah. It's that God told her this is exactly what's going to happen. And so this is God saying, I told you this was going to happen, and I did it. Promised, fulfilled. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said. And the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. That last one, I forgot to emphasize it. She had a son at the time of which God had spoken to him. God said this was going to happen. Verse 3. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. Let's stop there. Since we're talking about the Isaac thing, let's go backwards just a little bit, because this is going to be really important for you to remember tonight. Go back to chapter 17, Genesis chapter 17. Do you remember what Isaac means and where the name Isaac came from? It's important that you remember that Isaac is a Hebrew word that means he laughs. And this is not like one of those one-time things. We see it over and over and over again. It's going to be huge for you to remember that tonight. This is not the first time that we've talked about this. Verse 17, Genesis 17 and verse 17, then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. And God said, no, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. And maybe in my Bible I have a note next to the word Isaac. It's because, I'm not reading or speaking in Hebrew, and so I totally miss the word play that's happening in the text here. Abraham, you're going to have a son. Abraham, you're an old man. You're going to have a son. And he laughed. And God said, oh, you're going to laugh at me? You're going to name your son. He laughs. It's this thing that's going on like it. And this fits into what we're talking about right now. God is saying to him, no, I said this is what's going to happen, and when I say this is what's going to happen, then it's what's going to happen. That's the context that we've been reading about in Genesis 21. I think it's also interesting, and remember this for tonight, we're building a foundation here. It's also interesting that here in this story where Abraham laughed at God, it actually says he fell on his face and laughed. He's not just laughing. This is a hysterical fit. He fell on his face and laughed. And Abraham's mindset, please remember this tonight. Abraham's mindset is, can we just do this thing through Ishmael? I've already had Ishmael. He's right over there. He's my son. You said it's going to be my son. Let's just do that. And God said, you laughed at me. You're going to name your son that's coming. You're going to name him. He laughs. Isaac. Over to chapter 18. There's another one that happens. Verse 11. Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I have this kid now that I'm old? And then jump down to verse 15. Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. He said, no, you did laugh. So Isaac comes on the scene, and this whole thing leading up to it has been Sarah and Abraham laughing at God, almost the idea of, there's no way that this is going to happen. And God said, you're going to name your kid. Every time you say your kid's name, you're going to remember that you doubted me. And you remember, we talked about this the last time we did a Genesis lesson, or at least sometime. I don't remember when it was. Verse 3 of chapter 21. Abraham called his name. I guess this is the lesson. This is the one where we're seeing it. We haven't done this in the past. Verse 3, it's on the board behind me right now. Abraham called it the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And then jump down to verse 6. Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And so we're making a list here. The first thing in verse 1. The Lord visited Sarah. As he had said, the Lord did to Sarah. As he had promised, Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God promised. And then they named the son Isaac, and that's another. We've been reading this story. That's another one to add to the list where God says, I said, this is what's going to happen. And it's neat how you see this word play in the Bible. We know the laughing history, and Sarah says, here is this son that God promised me, and sure enough, he is my joy. He is my laughter. And everybody, what does she say? Everyone who hears this great news of mine, you're going to have joy with me too. God has fulfilled his promise. You're going to laugh with me. There's one more thing I'll put on the list here in verse 7. She said, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." And so this last thing is something kind of like this. Who would have ever believed that this would happen? And the funny thing, this is irony. The funny thing about this whole thing is, well, you should have believed because God said it was going to happen. And here we are after it's happened, and Sarah's like, who would have ever thought? Who would have ever believed that this was going to happen to me? And so verses 1 through 7. Put this in your mind. Probably put it in your mind because I'm almost certain I'm going to forget to bring it up whenever I need to bring it up at the end of this lesson, even though it's in my notes. Our context, as we move into what I think is going to be a difficult section, we're going to have to figure some stuff out as we read. But the context, this is important. The context is God saying, I do what I promised you that I would do. Remember that context. It's really important. Okay, so let's move forward. And the question in verses 8 through 12, we'll read the whole section and then we'll go back and we'll talk about this. But the question is, what's the problem here? What's the thing that's wrong? So read it with me. Genesis 21, starting verse 8. And the child grew and was weaned. This is Isaac. Isaac grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham. I'm sorry, did I read that right? Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. Now, our question is, what's the problem here? But immediately, we know that this laughing thing has been a major theme up to this point. And so automatically it went, ding! There's something that we're supposed to catch here. What is the thing? I don't know. But there's something that we're supposed to catch here. Verse 10. So Sarah said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Okay, so let's just throw the text up here real quick, verses 8 and 9. Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. What's the problem? I had no idea coming into this text that there's options here. How many spots do I have on the board up there? I think I'm going to give you 5 options. And I'll try and move through them pretty quick. The Revised Standard Version, New Revised Standard Version, says playing with Isaac. It says, Sarah saw Ishmael playing with Isaac. And maybe you're like, okay, nobody in this room has a Revised Standard Version, New Revised Standard Version. Who cares? Why are we even talking about it? Well, that's what's represented in the Septuagint, which is significant. And that's the Greek translation. That's Jesus' Bible, if you want to think of it like that. The Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. That's what this says, that Sarah saw Ishmael playing with Isaac. And VG stands for the Vulgate. That probably doesn't matter to talk about that now. But here is, oh no, I had a really good quote for you on that one. I'll read it to you anyway. It's not on the board. This playing with, Ishmael was playing with Isaac. It is the spectacle of the 2 young children playing together, innocent of social distinctions, that excites Sarah's maternal jealousy and prompts her cruel demands. And so the problem with this one would be something like Ishmael, the son of a slave woman, is playing with her son, Isaac, and she looks at this and she says, my son is not going to play with a slave son. And so she gets mad and says, get out of here. I don't think so. But that's at least one option. And some translators think that's an option. One option is that it's sexual misconduct. And you might say, what? Sarah sees Ishmael laughing, and we're going to turn that into sexual misconduct. But this word, look at Genesis 26. This word is used a couple different times in Genesis in that sense. Chapter 26 in verses 8 and 9. When he had been there a long time, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out the window and he saw Isaac laughing with Rebekah, his wife. So Abimelech called Isaac and said, behold, she's your wife. How then can you say she's my sister? And there's this conversation that goes on, kind of like Abraham lying about how Sarah was his wife. I think that most people, if you give this a little bit of thought, would look at this story and you would say, okay, Rebekah was not supposed to be Isaac's wife here. Abimelech said, she's going to be my wife, just like the Abraham and Sarah situation. But Abimelech looks out the window and he sees Isaac laughing with Rebekah. And his first response is, you're married. So maybe they're not just telling jokes to each other. That's the idea here. Maybe laughing, or what we saw earlier, the first version, playing with. Saw Isaac playing with Rebekah, if that's the sense. There's probably something more going on here than, we're laughing together. In Genesis chapter 39, and verses 14 and 17, this is the story of Joseph in Potiphar's house, and Potiphar's wife is accusing Joseph of something that he didn't do. So look at 39 and verse 14. She called to the men of her household and said to them, see, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And then verse 17, and she said, she laid up his garment by her until his master came. Verse 17, and she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to laugh at me. And that whole story involves sexual misconduct. And so what if that's one of our options? Sarah saw Ishmael, the son of Hagar, doing something that involved sexual misconduct with her newborn son, Isaac. Well, that at least explains why she got so mad about it and said, you got to get out of here. So that's an option. That's an option. Number 2. Most of your Bibles are going to say mocking. Or your New King James Version says scoffing. Sarah looked and saw that Ishmael was mocking Isaac, her son. Almost all of your Bibles say that. Okay. It kind of seems like if that's the case that Sarah's response is a little extreme. At least that's my opinion. I read that story. If that's true, Ishmael was making fun of Isaac, and Sarah's response was, go starve to death in the wilderness. Don't get on Sarah's bad side, if that's the kind of person that she is. And that's kind of what I was thinking as I came to this text. That doesn't make me have very many nice things to say about Sarah. I'm probably going to be hard on her if that's the one, but it's possible. Ishmael was mocking Isaac and she didn't like it. In Galatians chapter 4, well, our first rule of Bible study is always let the Bible interpret the Bible for us. And so in Galatians chapter 4, this is where Paul is making this story between some of us are the son of promise, the son of Sarah, and some of us are the son of the flesh, the son of the slave woman Hagar. And in that section in Galatians chapter 4, Paul says in verse 29 that Ishmael was persecuting Isaac. That's maybe the same thing as mocking or scoffing, but if you're going to call it persecuting, it's like turning up the volume, like he's really giving it to him hard here. That's an option. I'm going to say this one. The first time I read that this was an option, I almost completely disregarded it and said, move on with my life, this is no good. But this is where I land right now, and I'll try and explain why. I think what's happening in this story, read it with me again, verse 8. Isaac grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. What's the problem here? Well, what does the word laughing, how do you say the word laughing in Hebrew? Sarah looked and saw that Ishmael, the son of this slave woman, Abraham's son, Sarah saw that Ishmael was Isaacing. That's literally what it sounds like. That's literally what it says. And so let's make another list here. I'm going to try and make a case for this last one. That Ishmael threatened Isaac's inheritance from Abraham. Ishmael threatened to be the son of promise. God said to Abraham, here's this great promise, and it's going to go from you to your son, to his son, to his son. And we know that it went from Abraham to Isaac, but Ishmael is a threat to that promise. Number one, in 21 in verse 9, which is what we just read, Ishmael was Isaacing. Ishmael was laughing. Here's one commentary talking about this. The threat of Ishmael throughout the narrative is that he would replace Sarah's son, the heir of Abraham. Now, the wordplay, so crucial for the whole story, sets out the weight of the conflict. That's why I started in this lesson going back to chapter 16 and 17, reminding you that Isaac and laughing is a major part of the story. And so when we see that Ishmael is Isaacing, we're supposed to notice that. That's supposed to be something that jumps out at us. It does not imply that Ishmael has done something wrong with Isaac. The sexual misconduct thing, probably not. It suggests, on the contrary, that Sarah saw Ishmael playing the role of Isaac, the son of promise, the one who would inherit the promise from Abraham. So, if you go back to chapter 21 and verse 8, this whole context happens in the context of Isaac being weaned. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. I was reading some stuff. This is weird, I think, but in this world, in this context, that was probably somewhere around 3 or 3.5 or 4 years old when this happened. Listen to this, same commentator. Until this point, Ishmael could reasonably have entertained the expectation of being Abraham's sole heir. Listen, Ishmael's probably a teenager at this point. And for his whole life, he's been thinking, I am Abraham's son. I'm going to be the guy. And even the first time in Genesis 16, when Abraham laughed at God's promise, Abraham said, let's just make it be Ishmael. But now, Sarah got pregnant when she was an old lady, and she had a baby. It was a safe and healthy delivery, and this is kind of unusual in the ancient world. The baby survived, and the baby has grown, and now we're at this spot where we're pretty sure that Isaac's going to live. We're at the weaning celebration, and this is the spot where Sarah sees Ishmael Isaacing, taking the role of Isaac. And this is the spot where she sees that kid is a threat to the promise. I said the stuff instead of reading it. The conception of Isaac seemed impossible. His birth was exceedingly dangerous. His infancy was hazardous. Yet contrary to all expectation, he had come through them all. And now Ishmael's right of succession was at risk. So he started to make fun of Isaac's status. The very term mocking could be paraphrased Isaacing. Number 3, we haven't made it to verse 10. Let's look at verse 10. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. Sarah's, at least her main spoken concern. My first reaction when I come to this text is it's just like Genesis 16. She's just being jealous. She's been jealous from the start. She created this mess in the first place. Here, have Hagar and have a baby. But then they had a baby and she didn't like it immediately. But whether that's true or not, her spoken concern is, no, he shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. And so we're still in this context world of Ishmael is Isaacing, threatening to take the role of Isaac. Look at verse 11. Abraham, it says, was very displeased. I'll read it specifically. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. In Genesis chapter 1, God created everything and it was good. Abraham did not like that. Well, that's going to move us in, I think, to another part of this conversation. Look at verse 10. Do you remember? Listen to the way that Sarah talks about Hagar and Ishmael. Cast out this slave woman. Doesn't even call her by name. That slave woman over there, cast her out. And cast her out is what God did with Adam and Eve in the garden. It's what God did with Cain after Cain killed Abel. Cast her out. Get rid of her. She has to go. And so cast out this slave woman with her son. It's not Abraham's son. It's her son. The son of a slave woman. But then when you read in verse 11, and then we'll go a little farther than verse 11, the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. When it's coming from Abraham's perspective, it's not this son of a slave woman. It's, that's my boy. That's my son. And you keep on reading. What is it? Let's see. Verse 12. But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy, because of the slave woman, whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. In verse 13, well, as you keep on reading, I guess we're not quite there yet, but down in verse 14, so Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, she's named in this section, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And so, from Sarah's perspective, cast out that slave woman's son. From Abraham's perspective, he's not going to cast her out. He's going to send her away with provision. She's not that slave woman. She's Hagar. And he's not that slave woman's son. For Abraham, it's my son. And I'm saying all of this to try and go through the text and make this point. This is another commentator. Thus, the emotional heart of the family, especially the love of Abraham and Hagar for Ishmael, is laid bare in this distressing episode. I'll remind you of this. Do you remember the very first time when Abraham laughed at God after he said, you're going to have a son through Sarah? He said, he laughed at God, and Abraham said, let's just do it through Ishmael. It kind of seems like Abraham was all on board with Ishmael. That was his boy. This is who the promise is going to come through. And he had to be convinced otherwise. In verse 12, God speaks up. God is the one who says, this is what gives me hesitation. Maybe I shouldn't blast Sarah and what Sarah did and what Sarah said, because God said, no, this time you do what Sarah, your wife, said. It's time for Ishmael to go. So God jumps on the train and speaks up. That causes me to think, well, there's at least that. And then last, this is the last thing that I'll say. Turn over to Genesis 25. In Genesis 25, later, Abraham's going to take another wife. In chapter 25 and verse 1, Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. And then you jump down to verse 5. Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. So Isaac officially becomes the son of promise. But listen to this in verse 6. But to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts. While he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. So later in the story, the idea is, this is my son. He's going to inherit my blessing and the promise. Everybody else, though, you got to go. Everybody else has to leave, all the other kids. And it kind of seems like that's what's happening in this Ishmael story. Okay, let me read this thing, and then I'll get to it. I'll get to the point. In one point, Sarah is correct, but for the wrong reason. Ishmael will not share the inheritance with Isaac, but that is not because of Sarah's pettiness or jealousy or skullduggery. I just wanted to read it because I like that word. Sarah's skullduggery. It is because God has declared that Abraham's line of promise will be continued through Isaac. Remember the context that I said I was going to forget? The whole point of verses 1 through 7, God said, I made a promise and I do what I say I'm going to do. Isaac is the one, and that's it. That's what's going on here. Here is an instance of God using the wrath of a human being to accomplish his purposes. A family squabble becomes the occasion by which the sovereign purposes and programs of God are forwarded. So, here's the summary. And then I'll get to the one thing. We've done some mining tonight, learning about the text. What's going on here? What's the problem? I think this is the problem. Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, Isaacing. He was threatening to take Isaac's place as the son of inheritance. How about this, as far as a lesson for us to take away? When I saw, okay, that seems to be what the text is pointing me to, now the application becomes obvious to me, and it's a powerful one. If there is anything, or in this context, anyone who stands between me and the blessing and the promise of God, it's got to go. If there is anything or anyone that stands between me and God's promise, that thing's out of here. And you will know immediately, probably your head goes straight to the passages that my head went to. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus talked about this 3 different times on this extreme level. Matthew chapter 5, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. That's the point. The thing that we're talking about right now is the thing that Jesus said. If there is something, what your eye is attracted to, what you're looking at, if there's something that you're doing, some sinful thing, if there is something that stands between you and God and His promise and blessing, that thing has to go. However extreme it may be, nothing can stand between me and the promises that God has made. Matthew chapter 18 and verses 8 and 9. If your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than with 2 hands or 2 feet to be thrown into the eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. I know it sounds like it's the exact same thing that we just read a second ago. This is in another passage. Jesus apparently said it twice, and it's even more than that. Matthew chapter 10. This is not just if there's anything that stands between you and God, it's got to go. It also includes if there is anyone, like Ishmael, who stands between you and God's promise. Matthew 10:34. Do not think that I have come to bring peace on the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a person's enemies will be those of his own household. Whoever, this is where you start listening, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whatever or whoever stands between us and God's blessing has to go. That applies to jobs. I don't know what your job situation is. That's not true. I know most of you pretty well. I know what your job situations are. Some of you, may find that your job situation stands between you and the promise of God for whatever reason. Whoa, that's kind of extreme. You know what's extreme? Telling Ishmael and Hagar that they have to leave. And yet that's exactly what God did in this story. No, Isaac is the son of promise. Every other thing, every other person, gone. Whether it's a job, whether it's a person, whether it's a hobby, or any other thing, if it threatens God's promise and blessing in your life, it's time to send it away. Well, that's at least one of the things that I think I saw from the story of Isaac being born in Ishmael and Hagar. I haven't talked at all about becoming a Christian tonight, but this lesson is what becoming a Christian is. To look at your life and say, Jesus gave his life for me, and so I'm going to give my life for him. I'm going to give everything, which means I'm going to die to myself, be buried in the waters of baptism. And when I come up to walk in newness of life, now my life is his. He lives through me. And everything that comes between me and him, gone. If you're ready to do that tonight, we can help you. Come forward, make your needs known as we sing the invitation song.